Status quo, you know, is Latin for the mess we are in. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is the state of affairs in Sri Lanka. Joining us this evening on the show are Dr. Howard Nicholas, economist, Ambika Satkuranathan, former Commissioner, Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, Dr. Visakesa Chandrasekaram, Faculty of Law, University of Colombo, as well as Dr. Nimmi Nalika Manike, Senior Lecturer, the Open University of Sri Lanka. So let's start or get the ball rolling with Dr. Howard Nicholas, economist, with relating to the current state of affairs in Sri Lanka. Your time starts now.
Well, I actually start not with Sri Lanka, but the global economy. And one thing that I've been discussing with people in Sri Lanka since I've come here is the imminent global recession. I think some parts of the world are already in recession, and this has certain consequences for Sri Lanka. Now, one of the things that I think the government should be aware of is that in most countries in the world, once they realize that we're headed into global recession, they take compensating action. And this is what worries me, that I don't see that happening at the moment. On the contrary, I see some of the policies being implemented would actually aggravate the impact of the global economy, the negative impact on Sri Lanka. In particular, of course, when I look at the situation in Sri Lanka, for me the currency looks quite overvalued, too strong, in other words. Interest rates are extremely high. Taxes have risen. And basically, a lot of the subsidies and incentives given to producers have now been withdrawn. Now, this is not actually what should be happening as you're headed into a global recession. I'm not even sure that the promised welfare net has actually been put into place. So all I can see is that the full force of the global recession could well be hitting Sri Lanka. I've got some comments on the domestic debt restructuring and the supposed export-oriented industrialization strategy, which I could take up at a later stage. But
Dr. Nicholas, you spoke about the policy decisions that have been taken thus far would aggravate the country's economy further. Can you elaborate a little bit on this?
Well, one thing that nearly always happens in a recession is countries run big budget deficits. I mean, all countries do. There's virtually no exception to the rule. But what we are doing at this moment is actually trying to achieve a budget surplus. In other words, we're doing exactly the opposite of what countries do headed into a global recession. And that's likely to amplify the negative impact on the Sri Lankan economy. Coupled with that, we're now looking at domestic debt restructuring, which is likely to amplify the negative impact on interest rates.
But if you look at it, Dr. Nicholas, just a couple of weeks ago, the central bank revised its policy interest rates, but the interest rates that was dictated by the central bank is not being reflected as far as the banking sector in Sri Lanka is concerned. Why is that?
Basically because of the economic climate. So at this moment in time, it's a really, really difficult climate. And my understanding is the non-performing loans of the banks have reached quite high levels. So they're not really very inclined to increase credit to any sector of the society. And what I think they're doing is playing catch up, because their interest rates were actually quite low. And now they're adjusting these interest rates to reflect the economic climate. And that means to say they're actually raising these rates and deterring people from borrowing, because they're, as I said, they're already full of non-performing loans.
Dr. Nicholas, you all spoke about the proposed welfare, social welfare net has not been implemented yet by the government. But if you look at the recent past, we see the government taking steady decisions in terms of the Aswasma program that the government intends to launch in place of the Samruddhi beneficiary program. Are you aware of the contents of this program and how it's going to affect the Sri Lankan populace at a scale?
No, I'm afraid I don't know the details of that program.
Right. So let me give you a little bit of context, Dr. Nicholas. So the Samruddhi beneficiary program impacts 2.8 million individuals in Sri Lanka at this very moment of time. And the social safety net, the Aswasma program that the government has proposed, impacts approximately 2.1 million households at this moment of time. What I don't understand is when the country's economy is stressed to these levels that we are witnessing right now, the number reducing drastically by approximately around 800,000, is that justifiable in terms of the requirements of the IMF or even the World Bank to serve this, to serve those who are in this bracket?
Well, my understanding is that the IMF has actually provided a supplement to the Sri Lankan government for the welfare net. So it's that supplement that I would have imagined would be now forthcoming and being used to buffer the negative impact of the global economic recession. Now, I don't know whether that has been released, and I certainly don't have enough knowledge of which programs it was supposed to permeate. But it was a significant sum of money, and it's really the result of the IMF learning from the past that when you have structural adjustment, if you don't have protection for the poor, then the whole policy fails because there's popular resentment.
So, Dr. Nicholas, the current numbers based on what the government Census and Statistics Department have released, 35% of the population has now been dragged into the poverty line, below the poverty line. So if you look at related numbers, 2.8 million, you look at 35% out of that is around 980,000, 2.8 million plus 980,000 is approximately around 3.7 million. So actually the government should look at the 3.7 million at hand, and the government based on this program is only looking at 2.1 million. Is that justifiable?
I'm not in a position to answer a question like that because it's not an area of my expertise. Perhaps I should put it into some context. About 2001, I was asked by the UNDP to do a poverty alleviation study to look at the impact of adjustment programs on the poor in Sri Lanka. Now, what I didn't like about the terms of reference of that study is that what we're really being asked to do is to use sticking plaster to patch up the people who are damaged by structural adjustment programs. What I prefer to do is to say, why are we in this situation? Why do we have so many poor people? What other people tend to do is they count the numbers of poor. I'm not interested in that. I just want to know, why do we have these huge numbers in the first place? What are we doing wrong in terms of our economic policies? And I think that's where a lot of the problems are, that we keep counting the numbers all the time. You know, I mean, it's this number of old people that are in poverty, it's this number of women that are in poverty, etc. Why are we continuously in the same mess all the time? And I think this is the way lots of these studies and discussions are structured, where we actually avoid that elephant in the room. And I think that's very, very important to address that. I tried to do it in that study, and I don't know whether this is the right forum to say it, but I was told that this was not the terms of reference of the study. They didn't want me to actually say what the fundamental causes were. Rather, they wanted me to come up with recommendations for how we could mitigate the negative consequences of the structural adjustment program. I didn't actually complete the study because I refused to do that. It was completed, but not in my name.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Howard Nicholas, economist, joining us this evening on Face the Nation. I now move my attention towards Ambika Satkaranathan, former Commissioner of Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. What is your take on the current status quo in Sri Lanka?
Well, the current status quo in some ways isn't different from the past, because we've already always had a democracy deficit. We've always had corruption. We've always had problems with accountability, independence of institutions. Then following the end of the war, for 10 years, there was deep erosion of democratic values, because what the Rajapaksa regime did is they also changed value systems, and many institutions were severely disempowered. Then we had, and also militarization, excessive militarization. Then we had Yahapalana, where there was, I suppose, momentary relief, but like what Dr. Nicholas said, many of the root causes of these problems are not addressed, and what was done was beginnings of an attempt to patch up job. Then, of course, we know, Gotabaya Rajapaksa was elected, and we had the Aragalia. People were talking about system change, but what we have now is pretty much the same thing, in the sense that we have a president who is authoritarian, who a government which is pretty much the same as the past government, and what we see now is they're using the weapon as the law as a weapon. We have the Broadcasting Authority Bill. They tried to bring the anti-terrorism law. There are various other laws. I saw today they've also, I haven't read it properly yet, the Contempt of Court Tribunal or Institution Bill. So like that, they're weaponizing the law. We also see that the ICCPR is increasingly being used to crack down on dissent, as we saw a comedian who has been imprisoned. So we do not see any movement towards any sort of change, certainly not from within this government, because this government is clearly part of the problem. Perhaps if there was an election in the future, but even then the question of who is the alternative, and is the alternative going to be any different? Because everyone wants to displace the current elite, but I think what they want is for themselves to come into that position of power. And we have seen when people come into a position of power, they pretty much behave the same, because root causes. We say we're a democracy, but the democratic values have not been internalized. We have patronage networks. That's how society functions. We're a kind of a feudal society, and we have equality enshrined in our constitution, but in practice, discrimination, violence has been normalized. We have police brutality. None of those things have changed. In Sri Lanka, even if you read the Police Commission report from 1947, actually, I could say that I'm reading a report from 2023, which means that the institutions are severely dysfunctional, they are politicized, they are corrupt. So the question is, when we talk about reform, this is not going to be an easy process, because it's not about just passing a law or setting up a new institution. It is about changing culture, social culture, political culture, institutional culture, and changing mindsets, and that is long-term work. No one wants to do that, because that is not sexy, that takes time, that's really painful and long and tedious. But unless you have that, we're just going to be repeating this cycle again and again.
Ambika, if you look at your opening remarks, you spoke about how the Rajapaksa regime was anti-democratic and had the hallmarks of a dictatorial regime. Then you spoke about how Gotabaya Rajapaksa came into power. But in 2015 to 2019, there was the Yahapalani government in power.
I did also mention them.
Right, yeah, but what action was concretely taken, even if you look at the commitments that was made to the UNHRC relating to the aftermath of the war and prior to what happened, and nothing concrete took place.
That's what I said, because the Yahapalana too, there were patch-up jobs. And there were many issues that they were afraid to tackle because they were also afraid of the electoral impact of it, particularly in relation to the Human Rights Council. They co-sponsored the resolution. But they were afraid to implement it because they were also afraid of the electoral backlash in the South, because they would be deemed to be prosecuting war heroes, or they would be seen to be giving in to the Tamils too much. They did nothing about militarization. They did nothing about the informal security apparatus that exists and still functions, particularly the North and the East. You can see them engaging in all sorts of extra-legal action. That happens to this day. They did nothing to dismantle that.
So you were part of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka during this period.
Yes,
Ambika.
I was. Everyone was that.
And what action was taken back then to rectify these problems?
Well, not everything falls within the mandate of the Human Rights Commission. But as I've said openly, even about the Commission, the certain things the Commission recommended. It recommended many recommendations, but it does not have the power to issue orders, which means ultimately it is up to the government whether it implements the recommendations of the Commission or not. If it does not, there really is nothing the Commission can do about it. For instance, even the anti-terror, they brought about another law at that time, right? They didn't even give us a copy, despite the fact
2017,
the
counterterrorism bill.
The CTA. Despite the fact that we wrote repeatedly to the then president, who is currently the then prime minister, who is currently the president, Ranil Wickremesinghe. I think we wrote to him 3 times, asking for the copy of the bill, because it is within the Commission's mandate to review the bill and to give recommendations to the government, which they didn't even give it to us.
Right. Thank you very much, Ambika Satkaranathan, former Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. I now move my attention to Dr. Visekesa Chandrasekaram, Faculty of Law, University of Colombo. What is your take on the current state of affairs in Sri Lanka?
Yes, definitely. We tend to articulate it as a status quo. I think probably because as a nation we were traumatized by what happened in the last 12 months period. So considering the chaos that we have experienced in this time last year and also probably early last year, we think this is normal and this is status quo, and it is actually not status quo, and it's probably a status of decline, as we all seem to agree. Probably we are in a status of a ticking bomb, and I think the issue is that there is a short-term version of the status quo, and I think the long-term version is that, like Ambika said, this status quo has been continuing for, God knows how many decades, and there are a couple of things that we can observe in this particular environment, and this type of vicious cycle of poverty of the majority of the population in this country. There were kind of little bit of intermittence that we just saw ourselves rising out of poverty for a short period, and then we go down there, and there are a lot of people who are really struggling, and even before COVID, pre-COVID time, we have been hearing stories of farmers committing suicide and parents committing suicide with children because they couldn't feed their children, and we hear that stories more now. It's not that we had a paradise before, and I think that is one part of the story, and the second part is that gross injustice that we have been experiencing all this time, and possibly for last several decades post-independence. And that happened in a number of different ways. I mean, for example, the systematic discrimination of ethnic minorities and religious minorities in this country, and their grievances have never been heard, and we still keep quiet about those grievances. And I can't agree more with Ambika about militarization in certain parts of the country, and not being given justice for people who were affected by the civil war. And thirdly, most importantly, the systemic corruption in this country, and that is something that is part of this whole system, and it has been always there, and the thing is that it's going up and down from time to time. And it is a vicious cycle again, and there is an alliance between the public officers, the politicians, and the government servants, and the private enterprises, just to perpetuate this whole gross degree of corruption. And at the end of the day, I just see it as a rule of law issue, a huge rule of law issue, that we ignore the fact that everybody should be treated equally before the law, and certain elites or certain privileged segments. I mean, actually, there are layers of privileged segments in this society, so from high to the low, and they tend to escape the net of the law, and then they can commit all sort of crimes, particularly crimes against particularly corruption, and then get away with that. And if we look at the reasons, if we look for the reasons for the current crisis, I think one of the main reasons is that we fail to uphold rule of law, and different individuals or entities have been given different privileges.
You say, Dr. Visekesa, that the rule of law, the implementation of the rule of law is important. What transpired after the Aragalaya, subsequent to President Ranil Wickremesinghe taking oaths as the president? He did try to uphold the rule of law, didn't he?
I don't know in what context he tried to do that. The thing is, though, we have noticed few things post Aragalaya. We all know that Ranil Wickremesinghe became the president as a, direct or indirect result of Aragalaya, and what we saw was use of counterterrorism law, which was originally enacted to fight a civil war, being used against student leaders like Vasantha Mudalige, and they have been kept in remand without bail for over 3 months. And so then various attempts of trying to bring laws which allows the executive to arbitrarily apply their discretion and try to silence the voice of the dissent. So I don't think so. I can't.
So when you say in your opening remarks that we are now facing a ticking bomb, is it in terms of the economy or is it in terms of human rights?
I think in both sense. Now, I would probably define that the second aspect, human rights, in a broader context. Economy, I don't have to be an economist just to see the huge problem that we have, the huge debt issues that we have, and we, as Dr. Nicholas said, that we haven't done anything properly to address that, and then without going into that, then let's look at the whole humanitarian crisis here, and a huge proportion of the population is living below poverty line, and their life conditions or their situation is declining. And the thing is that they have seen how they can overthrow a government without proper political leadership. They have seen that they
so are you trying to say, Dr. Visekesa, this may happen again in Sri Lanka?
We don't know, and I'm worried about not happening that, but I'm worried about the way that the government is going to respond to that.
So we'll talk more about it momentarily, Dr. Visekesa. I now move my attention towards Dr. Nimi Nalika Manike, Senior Lecturer, the Open University of Sri Lanka.
Right. Considering the present situation in Sri Lanka, first of all, I want to say that I think this is just not present. I mean, if this present situation is chaotic, which is, yes, of course, chaotic, and this is what I think, this chaos has been continuing for many years. If I am to mark, at least say from independence, I mean, since it is a kind of turning point in Sri Lankan history. So from there on, and we have been having series of whatever that we have been experiencing in terms of violence, in terms of corruption, exploitation, discrimination, and so on and so forth. So therefore, I want to see this as something that has been continuously happening. It is just that probably maybe now, because of the advancement of technology and science and technology, yes, we get to see it often. So therefore, it's like constantly in front of us, and therefore, but in this context, what I see in trouble is the life and humanity. So that's the major concern, because whoever comes to power, what we see is that it's somewhere as a nation, as a community, together with politicians, we just can't make it just one-sided story. This is together with the people in the country that we have been kind of going with the murderous consent. Murderous consent, when I say murderous consent, maybe that we have just been silent, or maybe we have still gone and protested against for whatever that have been happening in Sri Lanka for all these decades. Yet, even in the stances that we have taken, probably we must have also been somewhere, politically inclined, or religiously, or ethnically inclined towards certain, certain groups or certain ideologies in a way that it backfires. So I think, therefore, if to think about the situation now as well as the past, and therefore to move to future in a constructive way, I think it is necessary for us to have a serious discussion where we look at things first impartially, at the same time giving importance to these two different but very important things. That is, one side the democracy, on the other side the ethical responsibility, without which I think we cannot really move.
Right. So Dr. Nimi, you speak about democracy and responsibility, but it seems that what is right now on the government's plate is the country's economy. And isn't that what should be the focus right now, because we are in a very bad state as far as the country's economy is concerned, and that should be the top priority at this moment of time?
Well, I think you can say that, but I think economy is, yes, it is definitely a must, but I think that's not the only thing that we are facing, because if we just take one aspect of the problem and then highlight it and then look into the other problems in that approach, then everything appears to be a problem of economy. But for me, at least this is my take, I think it is, yes, of course it is to do with economy, but economy wouldn't have come to this level if we were concerned about other aspects. As an example, like how we think, how we are made to think. As you rightly said, this is economy, so now our focus should be on economy. But why should it be only on economy? What about that what we have been facing throughout? Like what about say that if we focus on the politicians or the governments, what about them disrespecting people and cheating people and to get the vote bank, whatever the promises that they make, and finally people just consent? I mean, they are not ignorant, right? So we are not ignorant for what we have done. So therefore, if you want to reduce everything to economy and then to look at everything else in that approach, then we might not see the kind of roots of these problems. I think this is to do with our attitude. I think there is a kind of poverty, not just in economy, but also it's about how we think, how our thoughts.
But Dr. Nimi, the focus right now is what the government is saying. I'm just trying to be the devil's advocate. We have to first survive to talk about democracy. We have to first survive to talk about accountability or responsibility. So right now, the focus should be on the country's economy by hook or by crook. Shouldn't that be the priority at the moment?
Well, I think that's how probably you want to select it. But I think we can't rush to select like that. It is because, I mean, do you want to say that people, come what may, people have been trying to survive and they have been surviving? So that's why I'm saying, like, you know, people have been anemic. So are we just going to say that that's because of economy? Or it is also because of something else?
Right. So we'll delve a lot more deeper into these issues momentarily. So onto my immediate left is Neeraj Aliyathambi, senior journalist. You can direct your questions on the number 076-656-5353. I would be delighted to take those questions during the show. So Neeraj, as you're the only one who's being flanked onto my immediate left, I have no other option but to look at you.
Thank you, Shamir. So I'd like to ask Dr. Nicholas, you spoke of the probability of a global recession coming up. So you know that there's likely to be a global recession. We know the same because we read, we listen, and we generally stay abreast of what's going on in the world. But I haven't heard anyone in our government really speaking of this or addressing it at all. Do you think that our cabinet of ministers and our policymakers, that they know that there's a danger of a global recession?
I think, I mean, I can't read their minds, and I don't have any inside information, but I think at this moment in time, there's an obsession with sticking to the letter of the agreement with the IMF. And the IMF, for its part, also doesn't seem to understand that there's a global recession coming and will likely derail a lot of the agreements that they have made with Sri Lanka. Now, what I think is not being appreciated is the immense pain which is already being inflicted on the population. You know, it's not about the recession inflicting pain, it's compounding the pain that has already been inflicted. Now, I think it's what the last speaker said, it's this manic obsession, very narrow obsession with certain economic principles. And that principle is do whatever it takes to adhere to the IMF's package. And I think this is where the cabinet is at this moment in time. They've got a checklist and they're checking one by one. They're not aware of what's happening. They're not aware that policies have to adapt when the situation dictates. And I think that is what is very important. But there, I also blame journalists. Because I don't read in the newspaper the dire situation that is facing us. What I do read in the newspaper is we must do everything the IMF is asking us. You know, where's the independent thought? I don't read it. And it's the job of journalists as well. It's the job of academics. I don't hear it from the academics either. And I think this is a generational thing. In a past generation, people used to discuss all these things and say, look, doesn't matter what the IMF is saying, this is the reality of today, and we need to adapt
But
to
can
that
we,
reality.
Dr. Nicholas, can we do that? Because now we have already signed an agreement with the IMF for the first tranche to come in. And the recommendations or what has been set out has been passed in Parliament as well. Now we have to stick to it, don't we? Because if we do not stick to it, we won't get the second tranche and we are going to be in trouble.
I think if you rigidly adhere to things, when you see that actually there is this disaster coming straight at you, then you're not using your brain anymore. You know, you're just mechanically following something like, why am I headed to the cliff? I don't know, because the lemming in front of me is also headed to the cliff. You know, you're not thinking logically anymore and saying, wait a minute, you know, situation is now changing. We need to discuss things with the IMF. Maybe we get a deferral. But I don't see that discussion taking place.
Isn't that why the Sri Lanka has gone to the IMF 16 times? We've always gone to the IMF, got the first tranche, and then got rid of them. We've done it in our own way. We've tried it. We've seen how Ajit Nivard Cabral, the governor, has done the same thing. We've seen how governors, respectively, over the years, have done this.
No,
and
sorry.
haven't we seen?
Sorry, once you stick with the IMF, I have to now come back on them. Do you think Sri Lanka is the only country that has gone back to the IMF 16 times?
No, there are
What
many
about
countries. There are many
exactly?
countries.
And actually,
There's no question about that.
It's not a few countries.
Yeah.
It's about 85 to 90 countries. What is it about all these countries which keeps taking them back to the IMF? Answer is the IMF makes suggestions which actually are not structurally designed to change the system in Sri Lanka. They need Sri Lanka coming back to them in order to keep a grip on Sri Lanka. It's the same with all the African countries. It's the same with all the Latin American countries. And then what we say is, so we don't look at all these other countries, we say we have all these corrupt leaders, we make bad decisions, etc. What, 16 times? Are you kidding me? You know, I mean, the African countries, they say the same thing. We have all these corrupt leaders and we make all these bad, because we haven't learned
But what would have been the
economics
best
properly.
option, Dr. Nicholas, in your opinion? What would have been the best option?
So we actually have,
Are you
the
saying
example.
Are you saying that we shouldn't have declared bankruptcy last year?
Well, actually, we didn't need to, and that discussion has already been had. We know that bilaterals did make offers to the Sri Lankan government, and for some unknown reason, these offers weren't accepted. Now, actually, those submissions are with the Supreme Court, so I don't actually have to repeat them now. So we know that that was not necessary. I don't know why the decisions were taken as they were taken, but we know that we didn't have to declare bankruptcy. Okay, this was a deliberate choice. I don't want to go down that road, but what I want to say is...
But Dr. Nicholas, at that time, if you went on the streets of Sri Lanka, you were living in Sri Lanka, right, last year? So if you went on the streets of Sri Lanka, you'd have seen long queues, electricity being disconnected for 13 hours. And then you are saying that we shouldn't declare bankruptcy, but go... There was the governor at that time, it was Ajit Nivard Cabral. This governor of the central bank, he could have bailed us out, come as a phoenix rising from the ashes, and here we are. Sri Lanka is now debt free. That would have happened. It didn't happen.
What I can...
I was on the queue for nearly 48 hours. He was on the queue for nearly 48 hours. Probably you were not on the queue for 48 hours. I was in a gas queue for nearly 3 days. And I refused to stay in the line because I had work. So I knew the trauma that people had to go through last year. And because of the fact that we took a soft default, and many say that is the only way out. And we took that only way out. And now we are in this situation. So are you trying to say that that was not the way out?
Absolutely. And it's, you know, people come and say to me, look, we're in this mess, should we go to the IMF? Well, if you're in a mess and you close all other doors, then you have to go to the IMF. But what I've repeated for 35 years in Sri Lanka, learning from President Premadasa, we have had a choice in the past. We have the possibility of an aggressive export-oriented industrialization strategy. That did work, and it did work really well, and it has worked in all the successful countries in the world. The real question you have to ask is, why did we not repeat the experience of President Premadasa? Why? When we actually had the success.
So,
I mean, the success was there.
So, Dr. Nicholas, are you saying that at this point in time, we should be going for an aggressive export-oriented growth?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. If you can name me any country that has actually been successful without such a strategy, I'd welcome it. But so far, I haven't heard of anything.
And which sectors would you be looking at?
Well,
tourism or tea or?
No, what an aggressive export-oriented industrialization strategy means is manufacturing. There's no country that has ever developed on the basis of tourism, because it's actually a fickle industry. You know, if there tomorrow are riots again or political turmoil, tourism is dead again. We know that. And then people talk of IT. But actually, no country has succeeded without manufacturing. Recently, and this is, I came across a book, and it's a very interesting book. It's called How the West Got Rich and the Poor Countries Remain Poor. It's written by a guy called Eric Reinhardt. I'm not getting a commission from him for advertising his book, but he said this very interesting thing. He is an entrepreneur and an academic. He's born in Norway, and he said he wanted to start a paint factory in Finland. After submitting all his papers, the Finnish government went and asked people, do we need this guy for setting up a paint factory? In the end, they said, yes, we do. He said it was incredible. The Finnish government gave him every incentive you could possibly imagine, including several years subsidizing 30% of his wage bill. A few years later, he was asked by the European Commission to help promote manufacturing in Europe, and he got a map of the EU. And he said, what are all these colored pins everywhere on the EU map? Those pins represent all the incentives, all the subsidies, all the tax exemptions, everything you can imagine that the EU is giving all their producers in those countries. In Sri Lanka, do we do even 1/5 of that? Do we do even 1/10 of that?
Yeah.
No, we don't.
Yeah, but Dr. Nicholas, this sounds all nice. It sounds very cinematic when you speak about Finland, when you speak about how things work out and pan out. But let's not forget Sri Lanka. You know, if you look at Ali Sabri, the Minister of Finance at that time, said in April that the Sri Lankan reserves was at $20 million only. And then you are saying that bilateral countries wanted to support Sri Lanka, but I don't know which country that was, because if the bilateral countries wanted to support Sri Lanka, we wouldn't have been on long queues, nor have we had the gas queues and people dying in queues as well. If the bilaterals want to come and safeguard Sri Lanka, that could have happened in December. That didn't happen, did it?
No, you see, this is again what people come to me and say, look, you know, we had all these queues and people were really in trouble and so on and so forth, and you are telling us not to go to the IMF. Well, if you block off every other avenue and the only avenue you have left is the IMF, you think I would say you shouldn't go to the IMF? I was particularly critical of Governor Cabral when he just assumed the governorship, and the first thing he said is, I'm not going to go to the IMF. I mean, nobody says things like that. You have to do what you have to do at that time, given the circumstance.
There was a peg on the currency as well, which based on the Monetary Board of the Central Bank, they said $5 billion US dollars was spent on keeping a peg on the US dollar itself.
All of that is correct, but what I'm saying is, again, you're missing the wood for the trees.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is, Dr. Howard Nicholas, we are in this mess because of politicians.
No, sorry. We are in this mess because we're part of a world that is blocked from industrializing. And that is true of lots of other countries. The minute we cut a geopolitical deal, and that is what is now opening up for us, that the world now is going to be split into two camps. And they're going to vie for all the developing countries' support. And we now have an opportunity to do what we actually haven't been able to do up to now.
So it's the topic itself is under a lot of contention, whether we should have gone to the IMF or whether we shouldn't have gone to the IMF. At least now, Dr. Nicholas, there seems to be some hope, as the government has portrayed it to be, as far as the country's economy is concerned. I just want to move to Ambika, relating to what Dr. Nicholas said. He basically said that it's important to not take knee-jerk decisions, patchwork, and ensure that any decisions that are taken for the best interest of the public. But if you look at the government over the last few months, in terms of bringing in bills, look at the way in which bills have been tabled. The anti-terrorism bill came into play. We had Minister Vijayasa Rajapaksa in this very show saying that the bill will go ahead and that he's very confident that the bill will get a majority. And then a few days later, he seemed to have taken that bill and put it under the carpet. So now we're not discussing. Now we're not discussing about that. But now we're talking about a broadcast bill.
They could still pull it out.
They could still pull it out. But look at the way in which these bills are being tabled. Is this to take the people's mind away from important issues like the country's economy?
Well, I don't think so. One is that the drafting of legislation has always been a non-transparent process. This is not something new. As I said, even during Yahapalana, the Human Rights Commission, although we repeatedly requested the then Prime Minister to give us the draft before it was gazetted, it was not given to us. Therefore, this is not a new thing, the fact that civil society is not consulted, the fact that they draft repressive laws and they try to ram it through. Now we have another law which they are planning or in the works. Well, two of them which are very problematic and there hasn't been much discussion. One is, of course, something that successive governments have tried to bring in and somehow civil society has pushed back. But this government too is trying to bring, which is the NGO bill. That is to curtail the activities of civil society organizations, particularly in relation to funding, to prevent them from receiving foreign funding. They say they're going to formulate it along the lines of the Indian law, which is very restrictive and repressive. Then we also have, of course, there is another thing which they use as an excuse for the NGO bill, which is that counter-terrorism, anti-terrorism, because there's money coming in, they point to the Easter attacks and they use this as an excuse to say we need this bill. But the fact is we already have many laws. We have the Financial Transactions Act, which does relate to foreign funding and it being used for illegal purposes. Then the other law which they are trying, which is in the works, there's a draft floating about, is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That once again is to tick the box. It looks like a positive thing. It is, but in reality it is to tick the box to appease the Human Rights Council so that the resolution against Sri Lanka or on Sri Lanka will not be renewed in 2024. Now this bill is a farce because they plan to set up another institution. My question during the current economic crisis, do we need yet another institution? And what truth are you going to find that you haven't found out through the multiple presidential commissions, and not to mention the Task Force on Reconciliation Mechanisms, all of which actually to which victims went, they gave their testimonies. There are innumerable reports, there are thousands of recommendations. Some of the reports were not even made public. My point is, implement those recommendations and you'll probably end up solving 50% or more of the problems we have.
So Dr. Visakesa, now you spoke about this issue as well, about how it's important to ensure that you heal the wounds that were left behind by the conflict. There needs to be some some sort of accountability for what happened during the past. But is this what the majority of the people want?
Look, I think the democracy, well, first of all, we should ask, what do we need democracy or not? Democracy, yes, the majority of the people vote and elect a government, but it doesn't mean that we do always what the majority want. Democracy means that we actually try our best to protect the minorities. Now, the reason I went into that area just to focus on, not to deviate from the main, this whole economic topic, but I think there is a huge connection between the fact, the chaos and the mess that we are now in, as well as what we have been doing in the past in terms of ignoring the pleas for justice of certain segments of the society. And that's why I articulated it as a rule of law issue. Perhaps the majority may not want that because we have been basically brought up to think in ethnic and religious line, and we just, it's such a polarized society. Very easily now you can bring that whole racist and religious extremism, extremist ideas back to...
no, but is that what the people want?
No, I think...
no, I know. There has been, now Ambika spoke about how the UNHRC is very vigilant on Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka is planned to bring another bill just to appease the Human Rights Commission as well in Geneva. But is that what we want? How is that going to help from reviving the country?
Now, I think that the problem is that question itself, because we are going back to this kind of dichotomy of there is an economic crisis and we have to rebuild this country from in the economic sense, and just economy need to be rebuilt, and then in that and the rest is something else. So there is this kind of mutually exclusive dichotomy between economy versus non-economy, and I think this is a very dangerous approach to take. And the reason being, I think, as I previously mentioned, we are in this mess because we failed to exercise our democratic system, just implement our democratic systems. And I think now this is the very question that a lot of the people probably who are watching this program are asking: do we want to rescue this economy? So economy, or do we really want to talk about democracy in terms of the rights of the workers, which is going to be soon, slashed, and all these industrial law reforms that's going to be introduced, and all sort of other, couple of acts or the bills that's going to be brought just to suppress the dissenting voice. And I think that approach itself is problematic. I think we have to look at why we are here, number one, and also, like we all discussed before, why we are here, and also we have to look at how are we going to, who are accountable for this, who are responsible for this.
So Ambika, if you look at how things are transpiring now, Sri Lanka is in dire need of FDIs. Foreign direct investments. How important is democracy in this framework? Because to attract even FDIs and open Sri Lanka to investors as a whole.
I mean, as Visa said, it is artificial to look at democracy as something different from an economy. What is democracy? Democracy is holding politicians accountable. It is eradicating or trying to eradicate corruption. It is about transparency, all of which is required also to have a healthy economy. And the reason we're in this state is because in the past, when the elected representatives made certain decisions, we could not hold them accountable. So the economic crisis was due to democratic deficit, and crisis in democracy and crisis of governance is why we are here. And that, in the economy then impacts rights. Human rights are not just civil and political rights, they're also socio-economic rights. And when workers' rights are affected, or when people don't have livelihood, or when the military is taking over their private land, then they need to go and protest, because that is how they make themselves heard. But if you use the PTA or if you use the ICCPR to arrest them, then their civil and political rights are being impacted. So civil and political rights and socio-economic rights are very much intertwined. And that dichotomy is artificial. And if you don't have a democratic country, well, I think it is also going to be difficult to attract investment, because many countries, in European countries, have laws within their countries where, for instance, if they give a bribe even here, they can be penalized there. So therefore, that will prevent them. And I've heard enough stories of companies coming and leaving because they were asked certain bribes, etc. They are very much intertwined. It is not something separate.
So, again, I go back to the Yahapalaya time, because in 2015, when Maithripala Sirisena was elected, he promised to bring about accountability. He promised to bring to justice those who were involved in taking us, in terms of corruption and taking us down the rut and all that and more. Nothing concrete happened. All these politicians now are scot-free and are in parliament and are now thinking about their next move, if it's going to be a presidential or a general election next. We are in this situation because Sri Lanka got an opportunity, don't you think, Ambika? We got an opportunity to arrest all these problems and get on to the right track. It's just that we failed to do it because we didn't have the political will.
I mean, Sri Lanka has a history of missed opportunities. Repeatedly, the end of the war was one, Yahapalana was another, the end of the Aragalaya was another, and we still keep repeating the mistakes. Also because it goes back to what I said, the political culture, the social culture, where a lot of things are accepted. I mean, it's only in this country that you can, throw chairs in parliament, break the microphone, etc. And still, we're a country where also there is no shame. People don't resign. You can be accused of anything and no one is actually going to resign.
But there was one incident where Tilak Marapana resigned from his portfolio.
Well, one out of how many we are talking about.
But there was one incident. Yeah.
Right, okay. But so it's missed opportunity, and I think maybe the Aragalaya did have some impact in increasing the civic consciousness and civic awareness of people, because we do not only have rights, we also have duties as citizens, and one of them is to hold politicians, elected representatives accountable. And the Aragalaya brought about some change where there is awareness, but I don't think there is adequate awareness, because ultimately we are responsible for voting all these people in and for voting for them again and again.
Now, Ambika, you spoke of missed opportunities time and time again. But also, Dr. Nimmi, you were speaking of the fact that we shouldn't miss these opportunities, and that socio-culturally and economically we should have all of that going hand in hand to go forward. Do you believe we are missing an opportunity right now again? And how do we set this straight? There has to be a mechanism. It can't be an abstract thing.
True, very true, yes. I think what we are facing now and what we have been facing for many years is, of course, because of how politicians have used and exploited the situation. But at the beginning, and many other places as well, I have highlighted this issue. The problem with the politicians will remain as a problem, at least in this region, not just in Sri Lanka, even in South Asia. But the problem is that what have we been doing as responsible citizens of the country? What have we been doing throughout the history, or say recent 5 years? It is not just...
We did something major last year.
Exactly, I did not deny.
People came together and there was a huge movement, and as a result of that, the president had to go home, and fortunately or unfortunately, the current president is now the head of state.
But getting back to my question, how do we take this forward? How does
Exactly.
the country take it forward in
Yes.
practical terms?
Yes. So that's what I was trying to say. When I said that what have we been doing, I did not mean to say that we didn't do anything else. Yes, we did something. Like entire the country, despite a curfew, despite whatever the repression that was coming on us, we as nation, as a nation, as a community, we managed to break certain orders, and we dared to do the Aragalaya. But then what happened was something, because of it was a technical issue, right? From there on, it was to be taken in a different manner, because people could not go beyond that point. It was to be done legally, changing the governments and therefore the politicians and so on and so forth. What I have been trying to say, to you, it would look like it is not going to be practical. But what I am going to say is that whatever we want to do, as citizens, we have to be conscious, we have to be alert. We also need to be questioning ourselves as far as our grounds are concerned. Today we are taking this issue. Are we taking this issue just to highlight what is happening now and therefore to oust the government or whoever in power? Or are we really ready to take this as a challenge, therefore to question ourselves, and then to say that, okay, now this is what we need to do. Like, look at us, what we think. As you rightly said, yes, this is, of course, we want to boil down everything to economy. But is it the only thing that is governing our lives? So this is what I said. If we focus only on one aspect, let me tell you, like, okay, if we say that now as a country we have failed because of economy, which also means to say that there was a particular time that we were fine as a country in terms of economy. But then, referring to whatever the previous speakers have been telling, what about the violence? What about the killings? What about the disappearance of people? So do you want to say that all that happened because of economy? So therefore, when we want to address this issue as a crisis, which is multi-layered, this is just not going to be. This is just not going to make us come to a quick decision. It is not going to lead us to a kind of quick answer now. From today onward, let's take this nation to a different level by taking.
It would happen. It would happen over time. Dr. Visekesa, now, currently, right now, as we speak, there seems to be a regime that is trying to instill fear, because we saw prior to 2009, there seems to we had a self-imposed censorship taking place. Do you see the hallmarks of the then government now?
Yes, in many ways, though. And for example, so what we can see is, if you look at Natasha's case, the way that she was arrested, and for an offense that I consider is
Dr. Visekesa, before you say anything, I just want to alarm you that whatever views you're expressing will be of your own.
Yes, they are my
Because
own.
this is a pending case, and I would like
Yes,
to
yes.
advise you
Yes.
not to speak about it. And
I should know about that being alone.
as a journalist and the host of this show, I think it's my responsibility.
Yes, but what I'm
give you a
only
heads up.
talking about the procedural aspect, in the way that she was arrested and then being detained, and the use of a law. There are two options. One is a penal code, the other one is ICCPR Act, and so forth. And then after that, today, I was one of the speakers who spoke in a press conference about this whole incident, and I was excluded, but somebody else, Sarindu Duwaragedara, was summoned to the CID. Now, this whole thing, this is one example, that you could be arrested for saying something. Well, I'll leave it there. But then also you could be arrested for supporting somebody who has been arrested. And there is a kind of this systemic, cyclic way of harassing people who might be presenting dissenting voice. And now the thing is that you can see similar things happening in number of different settings. And each time when a group of people come to the street to protest, they would be bashed or tear gassed, and there will be water cannons and so forth. We have seen on a number of occasions, sometimes one woman or two women or three women just carrying some sort of a slogan and try to walk on the street, and they could be stopped and questioned and harassed. So the thing is, and also we very recently saw a mother carrying a child trying to protest just because she couldn't find a school for her child, and she was harassed by the police. Now, I think we started seeing these sort of things, and also there is a fear amongst activists and the members of the civil society that they just created that they feel fearful of trying to protest or even just to come out and make certain statements. That the feeling out there is that we should keep quiet for a while, we should lie low for a while. And why it is created? Because there is this fear being created. And there are a number of examples for that. I think that, so this is connected to the internal conflicts this regime is experiencing. We clearly know this is...
When you say internal conflict, you are saying that they are fighting inside the party?
We'll put it this way. I mean...
No, whatever way that you want to put it,
yeah,
Dr. Sigesa, but...
Yes, but the thing is, what we have is, we have...
How do you want to put it?
We have a member who actually lost the parliamentary election, becoming the president of this country.
That's the democratic framework in the country. That's the constitution in the country.
Yeah, that's right. But and at the same time, we have a party which very vehemently opposed and also criticized, very badly criticized Mr. Wickremesinghe, choosing him as a president. So there is a huge distortion in this whole thing. And then it is totally against the will of the people, because the people actually got rid of a president and the same party, and decided electing somebody who is not their leader or somebody from their party. So and those all who have done everything wrong are still there. So this is absolute distortion. So what I'm saying is, in a situation like that, what else are you expecting? There should be a lot of internal issues.
So Dr. Nicholas, onto your left are three human rights advocates, and your task is going to be now very difficult. The question that I'm about to pose you: how important is democracy and good governance for a country's economy? Is it important?
Well, I start with my own approach to economy is that it can't be divorced from politics and society. You know, there's no such thing. It's just actually a distortion which has entered academia, where people build these abstract models divorced from reality. And the reality is always a political reality. It's a social reality. And from my perspective, when I look at democracy, it's an ideal that I would support, but actually in reality there is no democracy. It's the rule of the powerful people. And one group passes the baton on to another group. Now, that's the reality. It's not just Sri Lanka, it's most countries in the world. The US is a democracy? Give me a break. You know, I mean, both parties actually are supported by the business community. It may be slight differences, but I think it was a Harvard study or Cornell study that showed that 93% of the policies implemented by the government had nothing to do with the basis on which they were elected. 93%. I mean, that just illustrated the farcical nature of a democracy. Now, this has happened in most countries. The real question is whether the people in power can be, in one way or the other, held accountable. And I think that is the crucial question. Because this idea, you know, should we have an idealized democracy and so on? Sorry, it's not going to work. You know, rich people will always use their wealth and power to influence politicians, you know, and they will influence policies and so on. However, what we have understood is for countries to have a sustained growth process. They actually need to come to a consensus. They need to include the population. And I think that hasn't happened in Sri Lanka. And I think it's really about inclusiveness. Do we have a system which is even remotely inclusive? And I don't think so. I don't think so. And
do we have a system, Ambika, remotely at least inclusive?
Not at all. In terms of
Have we ever?
I don't think so. No, maybe not that I can think of. But also in responding to both Visa and Dr. Nicholas about that, what he said, your question about climate of fear. That is something that has always also existed at different times in Sri Lanka's history, but particularly well constructed by the Rajapaksas after the end of the war. That kind of security mechanism where the TID, the CID or the military intelligence visit your home, they follow you, they stop you, they take photographs, they turn up at your institution, they harass you, they call you at 10 p.m. has been happening in the north and the east since the end of the war. It is new to the south. Started happening here only after, Gota was elected, and then we had the Aragalaya. So it is not something new, which brings me to my point that when something happens to one part of the community, it is good for everyone to be concerned about it because it is going to hit you at some point or the other, which is what has happened in relation to this. In relation to, Dr. Nicholas's point, I agree, but it's also about the U.S. is flawed. Look at the U.S. Supreme Court. We have police brutality. We have all that. But they still, at the end of the day, there are some checks and balances. There are certain processes. People can get certain remedies. And also, it's the climate of fear. The fact that here, brutality, people are afraid that they could just be shot or they could be arrested arbitrarily and silenced. That fear is what exists here, there is no idealized democracy in any part of the world, but it is about the extent of the repression, or whether there are some remedies, some institutional checks and balances, some accountability. And here we have none. Inclusivity in terms of social class, in terms of ethnicity, religion, LGBTIQ persons, the plantation community. We are not an inclusive society at all. I think we do exclusion really well. That is something that we do very well. And although our constitution enshrines it, I think in practice we really don't know what it means. The drafting of legislation is one example. Because what you should be doing is, particularly, let's say, the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you should be talking to the victims. You should take into account the report of the task force on reconciliation mechanisms. That shows that you're including them in a process that is going to affect their lives. So we don't know what inclusivity is at all.
So we have a question for Dr. Nicholas. What do you think, in your opinion, the real rate of the exchange Sri Lankan rupee vice versa the US dollar?
Somebody asked me that about 2 hours ago. I don't know. Do I look like somebody that immediately... Well, my son, who is seated over there, he just did quite a substantial calculation using what is called the Economist Big Mac Index. And he came to the conclusion that the exchange rate today is more overvalued, in other words, too expensive, than it was before the crisis. So if the exchange rate caused the crisis, or was one of the factors causing the crisis, then today we're in a worse situation.
What would be the rate?
We work with a ballpark figure of 400 to 400. The dollar. Yeah. So we think that that's where it's likely to head at some point in time. But
400 rupees, yeah?
Yeah. I mean, remember it was at 370, and at 370 our calculations showed that Sri Lanka is more overvalued than even countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh.
And you said, Dr. Nicholas, that exports, the export economy is very important to a country.
Exactly.
And having exchange rate like that.
Exactly.
Just tell me how it's going to be practical, Dr. Nicholas. That's why I said, well, it all sounds good and nice and, in a utopian environment, but how practical is it?
Well, just remember that we haven't really liberalized the big import items yet. There was a brief moment, apparently a couple of weeks ago, where for 3 days they liberalized car imports. And the rupee went from 298 to 330 in those 3 days, and then they shut down the car imports again. So once that liberalization of the big items takes place, once we have to start servicing the arrears of debt, once we have to do some of the amortization, I know that we're being given a grace period, then you will see the rupee move to its proper level.
But Dr. Nicholas, we are constantly told that in 25 years, in 2048, we will be a developed nation. Of course, we're not told much about what's going to happen.
President Ranil Wickremesinghe said that.
Yes, he did. Yes, several times.
Yeah.
Yes, and
I'm just reminding you.
yes, and I think you and I will be in our dotage even at that time, and I don't know where the president would be at the point.
2048. Yeah.
Yes, but is there any roadmap at all for even for the next 5 years, let alone the next 25? Because
I don't
you see the status quo right now, and then you're talking about the rupee perhaps going to 400, or it should be around there, and we don't know a year from now what the situation will be.
So your question is, have I seen a roadmap? My answer is no, I haven't seen a roadmap.
Do you think the government has a roadmap?
Well, their roadmap is stick as rigidly as you possibly can to whatever the IMF has asked you to do. That's their roadmap.
But the IMF never said anything about 2048.
No. But, if somebody asked me, I would always play safe. In 2050, this is going to be the situation. I'm dead by then. But being serious about it, I keep going back to this one point.
So
throughout history,
it is not very serious.
Sorry. Throughout history, the rich countries always sell dead rope to the poor countries. Always. It started with Britain, and they sold dead rope to the United States and Germany. They told Germany, look, you can be a coal producer, and you will become as advanced as us. They told the US, be a grain producer. And it was all their academics. Now the US tells developing countries, no, you produce raw materials and basic foodstuffs, you will be rich like us. We're still waiting. Of course, we know that's not going to happen, but what happens after a certain time is groups within our country, they repeat the same lies. They repeat the same nonsense. And basically we don't go anywhere. What they're doing is they're echoing the words of the dominant powers that want us to keep producing what we are producing. They want us to have tourist industry. They want us to basically produce essential food items and raw materials. In our case, we don't have that many raw materials, but I've been told that Sri Lanka can become an agro-industrial power. That's what I've been told recently. In other words,
agro-industrial power, what are we going to export?
Yes, well, so far I haven't seen anything. I mean, I'm not against agriculture. I think you need a very solid agricultural base for any industrial strategy. All the successful countries have had good domestic food production sectors.
At least, Dr. Nicholas, we were self-sufficient in rice.
Exactly.
Until the fertilizer crisis took place. And now we're talking about an agriculture industrial strategy. I don't know from where to laugh, unfortunately, Nidesh, I really don't know what that strategy is, Dr. Nicholas.
And what I wanted to do was come back to the point you made earlier. You see, what I hear repeated all the time is this fear campaign. Do you want to go back to the dark ages of us being in petrol queues and so on and so forth? You know, we frighten the population, and then what we say is, if you don't, you accept the IMF's policies. You know, in other words, out of the frying pan, into the fire. Which one do you want to choose? And I think that once you're in that situation and you've inflicted fear on people, they're not thinking rationally. Has this worked in any country at any time? Has it?
Right. Let me ask you a very simple question, Dr. Nicholas, before we go to the final round. Can the present leadership in Sri Lanka take us out of this mess?
Difficult for me to answer this because I actually haven't seen the policies that they want to implement.
So you're saying can't?
Well, if they're only going to implement IMF policies, they can't. You know, because that's not going to take us, it'll take us temporarily out. And what we know is that because all the attention that has been focused on Sri Lanka continues, there will be a lot of international support for us. So temporarily, we will have some breathing space. Will it translate into a permanent resolution of our problems? Absolutely not.
Right. So I want to, Nilesh, any questions?
No, go ahead.
Right. So want to go into the final round. I want to give each speaker 4 minutes to wrap up your thoughts with regard to the current state of affairs in Sri Lanka. So let's start off with Dr. Nimi Nalika Marike.
Right. I think given the situation in the country, keeping hopes on any political party that we can name in Sri Lanka is not going to help us. It is because they have been there throughout, and we cannot see anything done to take care of the nation, to take it ahead. So therefore, I want to highlight the very fact that as people of this country, as citizens of this country, we have a responsibility to change this system, not just by changing political, say, parties, rather to come out of this vicious circle of practicing violence against whatever the communities, therefore dividing the country, I mean, not just geographically, but as a population, just highlighting the categorical existences of people. So therefore, I think it is high time for people to be aware of what is happening, and then thereby, I think, I want to highlight this fact that media having a huge responsibility to bring out these issues, not just to highlight or not just to attack a particular group or particular community, rather to bring all these issues as truth that we are facing as a nation, therefore to make people aware and then to ask. For that, I think we just can't start from somewhere above. We also need to, these are going to take, of course, these are going to take time, but we need to focus on the content of the education that we have, the policies that we have, as well as the advisory bodies, the people who are in the advisory bodies to these politicians. Because politicians will always go with the popular idea and they seek popularity. But what about the people who advise them? What kind of advices they have been making? So maybe they are intellectuals, maybe they are civil servants, but who is ready to question them? So therefore, I think it is, I don't think just questioning a political party or a politician would solve this issue. Rather, I think we have to be impartial in each situation to look at things critically and then to start from there. But that, of course, as of now, it looks vague, but if we are not ready to question ourselves, our own grounds, even this particular discussion, then I don't think that we can anyway move far.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Nimmi Nalaka Manike, Senior Lecturer at the Open University of Sri Lanka. I now move my attention to Dr. Visikesa Chandrasekaram, representing the Faculty of Law, University of Colombo.
So I think what is important is that we know it is going to be painful, whatever the economic pathway that we're going to take. We are already suffering some pain, but I think what is really important for the people and for myself, that I am ready to undergo that pain only if everybody is ready to do that. There are people who should be held accountable for this present crisis, are enjoying full impunity and not going to face any consequences. And they should be brought to justice, and also the politicians, the privileged class, and they all have to bear the cost and the brunt and the portion of their sufferings like we do. And secondly, I think the IMF and the international community and all these international players should not undermine the democracy of this country. And although we don't have a full democracy, this is, they need to protect, they need to focus on the fundamental rights of the people and also the democratic institution of the people. So if they are asking us to follow the certain roadmap, that is, in this case it's IMF roadmap, I think it is still important that they do not lose the focus of human rights, and so they can keep influencing the government on protecting the human rights. Now there are, I think, 4 things that we need to look into in this whole discussion. One is, what is our economic choice, the choice for economic plan. And I think there seem to be, according to this discussion, there seem to be something more than the IMF roadmap, and we have to think about those other options as well. There should be, perhaps there can be times that we have to say no to certain IMF demands. And secondly, I think we have to basically remedy all the corruptions, past, present, and future. By what I mean is that those who are responsible for corruption, gross level of corruption, should be punished. And also we have to have systems that's not going to happen in the future. How are we going to do that? That's a very long discussion. And thirdly, I think we should not lose the welfare protection and also the rights we have earned so far. Particularly I'm talking about rights of the workers that we are likely to lose, and also all other rights that we have earned in the past. And finally, I think we have to make sure that we protect the most vulnerable segments of our population, most poor, most vulnerable, and segment of our population need to be protected whatever we are doing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Visikesa Chandrasekaram. The pain is coming, Dr. Visikesa.
Yes.
Don't worry.
I'm not going to take it by myself. We all have to take it, and including all those people who are running this government.
And for some people, the pain has been there for a very long time.
That's right.
And they're going to suffer even more.
Yes.
I think that is something that we should not forget.
Ambika.
In Sri Lanka, when we talk about any big changes, the government, not just this government, but all governments, they bring about change only at the behest of some international body or the other, whether it's the Human Rights Council or the IMF, and that is the wrong way, because this is not about what they want us to do, but about us doing whatever that is required for the benefit of our public. And the politicians don't do it because I think we have been I wouldn't say unlucky, but history of self-serving politicians, which brings me to the point of the fact that citizens have to take some responsibility for electing them and re-electing them. That is because everyone has a vested interest. They would rather vote for the politician who they can go to and get a job rather than following due process. We are not a society based on the rule of law. We don't like processes, and the vested interests don't want substantive structural change. Like, for instance, the Rajapaksas are accused of corruption of millions of rupees. Everyone's outraged, but how many people don't mind giving 1,000 rupees or to the traffic cop to escape a fine? But that is also corruption. So therefore, which is why we've normalized a lot of dysfunctional, illegal practices in this country. Also, this is a country not functioning based on the rule of law. We have many informal rules, processes, systems that sometimes take precedence over the rule of law. And that is a huge problem, which then goes back to your point also about education system. What do we teach our children at home? But one thing that we must know is prosperity does not come with exclusion. Prosperity does not come with bigotry. And we are a bigoted society, in relation to ethnicity, religion, LGBTIQ people. So when you have bigotry and you have exclusion, you have discrimination, you have violence, it becomes normalized. You cannot have prosperity. That is something that not just the politicians need to understand, because the citizens, because they're also in some ways complicit in perpetuating this culture of dysfunctionality.
Thank you very much, Ambika Saskarunathan. Dr. Howard Nicholas.
Difficult to know where to start because, of course, we've been coming back to the economy all the time. But I want to link it to this notion of democracy. And there, I think I was on Face the Nation some time ago, and I raised this question about an independent central bank. Now, for me, a lot of these things, and this is what you just referred to, have been imposed on us. And basically, the independent central bank idea, which is in the Central Bank Act, is undermining a very important aspect of our democracy, and that is holding the important policymakers, not just the politicians, to account. Now, I have a different take on the US. I think actually it's one of the most undemocratic systems in the world, because if you look at the Federal Reserve, there is no accountability with the US Federal Reserve. They're only accountable to the rich elites. We've just heard 2 days ago that in the recent bank crisis, they actually transferred another $12.3 billion to the private sector. During the COVID crisis, we now know that they transferred something like $6 trillion. Now they want us to have an independent central bank that actually will not be under the democratic control of Parliament. No matter what they say, it's not going to be the case. To compound this, we now have domestic debt restructuring imposed on us. We are told that unless you do that, the foreign bondholders will not accede to restructuring. And
Well,
nobody...
That's the usual case, no, Doctor?
No, it's not the usual case. Now you have to listen to just this very important point. When foreign bondholders buy Sri Lankan debt, it's on the presumption that it's risky. Why? Because the government does not print dollars. It prints rupees, but it doesn't print dollars. When a Sri Lankan bank or Sri Lankan company or an individual buys rupee debt, it's on the presumption that it's 100% risk-free. Now, the foreigner has said, you must treat us equally, even though the two asset classes are totally different. And that is why the foreigner gets far more than the person buying Sri Lankan debt. Again, my son did a quick calculation. If you held 5-year ISB, International Sovereign Bond, from 2014 to 19, you would have got on average 6.25% a year. If you held a 5-year Treasury bond, that's a Sri Lankan rupee denominated bond, you would have lost 4% a year. Now, that is why we pay, because the higher risk, the Sri Lankan government doesn't print dollars, that's why we pay foreigners a premium. But now they're telling us, no, forget all of that, you also have to take a haircut, because we're taking a haircut, even though the two asset classes are totally different. And the question I ask is, why aren't we fighting back against that? Why aren't we pushing back? This is ludicrous. You shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't be imposing this on us. What they're trying to do is push us further and further because we're desperate, you know? And the fear factor is always there. If you don't do this, we're not going to continue supporting you, you won't get the second tranche, etc., etc. So we do everything, you know. It's the monkey jumping for the peanuts, basically. You know, we'll do anything that it takes. And I think, you know, we're not only undermining the democratic essence of our system, but we're abrogating our responsibility to the people of the country by doing this. Because one of the consequences of the domestic debt restructuring is, for the first time ever, we're going to make domestic debt a risky asset. And the minute you do that, let me just give you the example of what's going to happen in the coming global recession. So from now on, remember, we're going to say the government can default on debt. It can default. We're coming into a global recession. The central bank is not going to be allowed to buy domestic debt. The government will have to run a budget deficit. It has no choice. When it runs the budget deficit, immediately its credit rating is going to fall because it won't have the resources to pay that debt. That means interest rates will rise in the middle of a global recession. So we can't run the deficit we need to run, and interest rates will rise. And we're doing all of this because we're so frightened that the IMF will pull the plug and say, well, sorry, if you don't agree to domestic debt restructuring, then we're not going to give you the second tranche. But meanwhile, actually, we're destroying ourselves, you know, and it's going to be far more damaging than not actually continuing with the IMF agreement.
Thank you very much, Dr. Howard Nicholas. Some important thoughts. Quite interesting, isn't it?
Quite an eye-opener.
Quite an eye-opener. Thank you very much, Dr. Howard Nicholas, for joining us this evening on the show. I'm Satkaranathan, former Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, Dr. Visekesa Chandrasekaran, Faculty of Law, University of Colombo, Dr. Nimmi Nalika Manike, Senior Lecturer at the Open University of Sri Lanka. Nirish, thank you very much for joining us as always on Face the Nation. We leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do. People who demand neutrality in any situation are usually not neutral, but in favor of the status quo. Take care and good night.